Home is supposed to be your sanctuary, a place where the world stays out and you stay safe. But for Mark and Elena, their new home was hiding something. Something that didn't want them there. Something that lived within the very bones of the house. It was a Victorian-style house on the outskirts of Blackwood Creek. The price was suspiciously low, but the real estate agent swore it was just because of the aged aesthetic. Mark, a freelance architect, saw potential. Elena, a writer, saw a quiet place to work. They moved in on a rainy Tuesday, unaware that the house had already been watching them from the moment they stepped onto the porch. The first 3 nights were peaceful, but on the 4th night, as the clock struck 3:14 am, the sound began. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was faint, coming from the wall behind their headboard. Mark woke up, rubbing his eyes. Mice, he whispered to himself. He tapped on the wall, and the scratching stopped instantly. He went back to sleep. But the next night, it wasn't just scratching. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged behind the plaster. Alina started noticing things during the day. She would find tiny pieces of wallpaper peeled away, curled up on the floor like dead skin. The air in the bedroom began to smell, a cloying, sweet scent of rot mixed with old perfume. Mark, I don't think it's mice, Alina said one evening, her voice trembling. I heard a voice today. A whisper. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall. Mark laughed it off, but his heart wasn't in it. That night, he stayed awake. He grabbed a flashlight and waited. At 3:14 am, the scratching started again, but this time it was frantic. It sounded like fingernails digging into wood. It moved from the headboard down to the corner and then up toward the ceiling. Mark jumped out of bed and pressed his ear to the wallpaper. He could hear breathing. Heavy, wet, labored breathing. Driven by a mixture of fear and rage, Mark grabbed a hammer from the garage. I'm ending this tonight, he growled. He began to tear away the wallpaper. Layer after layer of old floral patterns came off, revealing the grey lath and plaster underneath. As he peeled back a large section near the floor, he stopped. His blood turned to ice. Behind the wallpaper, hidden in the space between the studs, were hundreds of small, jagged holes, and stuffed into those holes were locks of hair. Grey hair, blonde hair, blood-stained hair, all tied with tattered ribbons. Mark, look up, Elena whispered, her face pale as a ghost. Mark shined his flashlight higher. There, at eye level, a single large eye was peering through a crack in the wood. It wasn't a human eye. It was milky white, wide with madness, and it didn't blink. Mark swung the hammer with all his might, smashing through the lath. The wall crumbled, revealing a narrow, hidden crawl space that ran through the entire perimeter of the room. Inside the crawl space sat a figure. It was a woman, or what used to be a woman. Her skin was the color of parchment, stretched tight over her bones. Her fingernails were gone, replaced by bloody, jagged stumps from years of scratching. She was wearing a tattered wedding dress that had turned yellow with age. But the most terrifying part? She wasn't alone. The walls were lined with old clothes, suits, dresses, children's outfits, all carefully stitched together to form a nest. The woman lunged forward, her jaw unhinged, emitting a high-pitched, rhythmic clicking sound that mimicked the scratching they had heard for weeks. Mark and Alina didn't wait. They ran. They didn't grab their keys. They didn't grab their phones. They ran until their lungs burned, and they reached the main road. When the police arrived and tore down the walls of the house, they found more than just the woman. They found a network of tunnels connecting every room. The woman, identified as the daughter of a previous owner who had gone missing 40 years ago, had never left. She had been living in the shadows, watching every tenant, waiting for the perfect moment to collect them. The police found Mark's missing watch, Alina's lost earring, and a collection of Polaroids taken from inside the walls, showing Mark and Alina while they slept. Mark and Alina never went back to that house. It was eventually demolished, but locals say that if you stand near the empty lot at 3:14 am, you can still hear it. The sound of fingernails on wood. Scratch, scratch, scratch. So, next time you hear a sound in your wall, don't just assume it's mice. Because some things don't just live in the shadows, they live in the very walls you call home. They say some doors are locked for a reason. Not to keep people out, but to keep something in. Sarah was a woman who didn't believe in ghost stories until she moved into the studio on 7th Street. Sarah was a struggling artist looking for a place with high ceilings and low rent. She found it in an old, red brick industrial building that had been converted into lofts. Her studio was perfect, except for one thing: a small, heavy wooden door in the far corner of the room, secured with a rusted iron padlock. The landlord, a frail man who refused to look her in the eye, was very specific. "The rent is cheap because of that room," he said, his voice cracking. "Never open it. Never try to look inside. Just pretend it doesn't exist, and you'll be fine." For the first week, Sarah followed the rules. She set up her canvas, her paints, and her brushes. But as an artist, she was naturally curious. Every time she painted, she felt a heavy gaze on her back. It was the kind of feeling that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Whenever she turned around, there was nothing but the locked door. Then the sound started. Not scratching, like the first story, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from inside the tiny locked room. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded like someone was pacing in a circle, over and over again. One rainy night, Sarah was working on a large portrait. The pacing behind the door became louder, more aggressive. She couldn't take it anymore. "Is someone in there?" she shouted. The footsteps stopped instantly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Driven by a mix of frustration and fear, Sarah grabbed a heavy crowbar. With a few sharp movements, she snapped the rusted lock. The door creaked open with a sound that felt like a scream. Sarah shined her phone's flashlight inside. The room was tiny, barely a closet. It was empty, except for a single, ornate wooden chair sitting exactly in the center. The chair was facing the wall. There were no windows, no vents, and no other exits. Just a chair, Sarah whispered, letting out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She locked the door with a new chain and went to bed. The next morning, Sarah woke up and went to her canvas to continue her work. She froze. Her painting, a portrait of a landscape, had been altered. In the background of her painted forest, someone had added a tiny, detailed image of the wooden chair from the locked room. Sarah felt her heart race. She lived alone. No one had a key. She decided to set up a motion-activated camera in her studio. That night, she slept with a kitchen knife under her pillow. The next morning, she checked the footage. The video showed Sarah sleeping peacefully. But at 2:44 am, the locked door slowly began to open, despite the new chain. No one came out. Instead, the wooden chair slowly slid out of the room on its own, inch by inch, until it stopped right next to Sarah's bed. The camera then showed something that made Sarah scream. A thin gray hand reached out from the darkness of the open door, grabbing the edge of the frame. Then, a face emerged. It was a face with no eyes, only smooth, pale skin where the sockets should be. The entity leaned over Sarah, its long skeletal fingers hovering just inches above her throat. It stayed like that for 3 hours, just listening to her breathe. Sarah didn't wait for the sun to fully rise. She grabbed her bag and ran for the exit. But when she reached for the front door, it wouldn't budge. She turned around and saw the wooden chair sitting in the middle of the hallway, blocking her path. The gray figure was now sitting in the chair, its eyeless face turned toward her. It spoke, not with a voice, but with a vibration that shook Sarah's very bones. You opened the door. Now, you are the roommate. Sarah smashed a window and leaped out, barely escaping with her life. She never went back for her paintings or her clothes. When the building manager finally entered the studio a month later, Sarah was gone, but her art remained. Every single canvas in the room had been repainted. They all showed the same thing. A woman sitting in a wooden chair, her eyes sewn shut with black thread, staring into a dark open door. Sarah's whereabouts are still unknown. Some say she's hiding in another city, too afraid to look at a chair or a closed door. But the next time you find a locked room in an old building, remember Sarah. Some things aren't locked away to protect the world. They are locked away because they are waiting for an invitation. We've all heard house noises, pipes clanking, floorboards groaning. But what if the house sounded alive? What if it had a pulse? The Miller family moved to the countryside for peace. But what they found beneath their feet was a rhythmic nightmare that refused to stay buried. The Miller family, David, his wife Clara, and their 7-year-old son Toby, bought the old Henderson farmstead in late autumn. It was a sprawling property with history etched into every wooden beam. But from the very first night, David felt something was off. It wasn't a ghost he saw or a voice he heard. It was a vibration, a low, rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump that seemed to originate from the heavy iron door in the kitchen floor, the door to the basement. "David, do you hear that?" Clara asked one night, her eyes wide with exhaustion. "It sounds like a heartbeat." David tried to be the rational one. "It's just an old water pump, Clara. Or maybe the heating system." But deep down, he knew no machine sounded that organic. No pump had a rhythm that sped up when you got closer to it. Toby started refusing to go near the kitchen. "The floor is breathing, Daddy," he would say, tears streaming down his face. "The man under the house is hungry, and I can hear his heart." 2 weeks into their stay, the vibration became so strong that pictures started falling off the walls. David decided he had to face whatever was down there. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and a crowbar, prying open the rusted iron door. The air that hit him was thick and metallic, smelling like a butcher shop in the middle of summer. He descended the wooden stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The basement was vast, filled with old farm equipment and jars of rotted preserves. But the sound was loudest in the far corner, where the concrete floor was cracked and buckled upward. Thump, 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 thump. David knelt by the crack. He shined his light inside. He expected to see a pipe or a generator. Instead, he saw something pink and wet. Something that moved. It looked like muscle tissue, growing out from the dirt, pulsing with a life of its own. In a fit of panic and curiosity, David began to dig. He chipped away at the concrete, his hands shaking. As he cleared the debris, he realized the basement floor wasn't just concrete, it was a seal. Underneath the house, buried in a shallow pit of red clay, was a massive, pulsating mass of flesh. It was too big to be an animal. It looked like a giant, disembodied heart, the size of a car, connected to the foundations of the house by thick, vein-like roots. As David stared in horror, he noticed something even worse. Sticking out of the fleshy mass were human belongings. A wedding ring, a pair of glasses, a child's shoe. This thing hadn't just grown here, it had been fed. Suddenly, the heartbeat stopped. The silence was deafening. David backed away, but the vein-like roots on the floor began to twitch. They moved like snakes, sliding across the dirt toward his boots. He scrambled up the stairs, slamming the iron door shut and bolting it. But the house began to shake. The walls groaned as if the entire structure was in pain. From the kitchen floorboards, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep upward. Blood. "David. Toby is gone," Clara screamed from the living room. David ran to the living room, but the floor had already opened up. A massive crack had split the house in two. Looking down into the dark abyss, David didn't see Toby. He saw 1,000 small pulsating eyes staring back at him from the walls of the pit. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was an organism, and they were inside its stomach. David grabbed Clara, and they barely made it out of the front door before the entire house collapsed in on itself, sinking into the earth like it was being swallowed by a giant mouth. No debris remained on the surface, just a deep, circular hole in the ground that smelled of old blood. Toby was never found. The police dismissed the story as a sinkhole disaster caused by old mining tunnels. But David and Clara know the truth. They still hear it in their dreams, the rhythmic thump-thump of a heart that lives in the earth, waiting for the next family to build their sanctuary on top of it. Next time you're alone in your house and you hear a strange thud from the floor below, don't just ignore it. Put your ear to the floor. If you hear a heartbeat, run. Because you might not be living in a house. You might be living on a meal.